Hi, everyone. So, this is part three of our lecture about literary criticisms. Okay. And today we'll talk about psychoanalytic criticism, its assumptions, and its basic concepts. First assumption is it says all artists are neurotic. Neurotic. It means that, an artist is creating something, somehow creates a world of his own, and it's been manifested in his artwork, perhaps, or in his literary texts, in his books or stories, or perhaps poem. So it's kind of a way of escape of many outward manifestations and results of neurotics, such as madness or self-destruction, by finding a pathway back to saneness and wholeness in the act of creating his or her art. So these desires that a person is, in this case, psychoanalytic criticism considers as neurotic, the artist, is just an outward manifestation. Without this outward manifestation, the man, the artist, perhaps would do it in reality. But this is just an escape from that particular manifestation. Perhaps the person is trying to destroy himself, or perhaps is creating a world of his own. Okay, and by doing so, by creating an outward manifestation, he was able to go back to his you know sane ness. Okay. Anyway, number two, the second assumption of psychoanalytic criticism, it says an author's chief motivation for writing is to gratify some secret desire, some forbidden wish that probably developed during the author's infancy and was immediately suppressed and dumped in the unconscious. Um, Hidden meanings contained within the story and housed in symbols. So, so anyone, an artist in this case, is motivated to write something, or perhaps is motivated or inspired to create an artwork, uh, and in these works somehow says something about the mind of the author himself. It has to say something about what is thinking. It has to say something about these particular perhaps forbidden wish, um, or perhaps a forgotten experience when he was still or she was still infant. Okay, so these are untold stories that can only be uncovered and manifest can only manifest itself in stories or art, okay, or other forms of art. Now we'll talk about these in infancy stage later on. Letter C, the text can and must be analyzed like a dream. Now we've been reading a lot of when we were still kids, children. We've been reading literary texts, children's literature, stories about magic, and so on and so forth. Now, it's still also similar to the contents of your dream. You have a dream about these monsters. You have a dream about going to far places. You have a dream about in a certain kingdom by the sea or whatever. So we have a lot of dreams, as bizarre as maybe it may be. But yeah, it's still a dream. Similar to stories, these dreams are quite, unexplainable, and most of the time symbolic. So in order to understand a certain, like, say, a story, we have to treat it like we're, listening to someone else's dream. Now, dreams are interpreted as a disguised wish. For so long, we human beings tend to believe that our dream says something about our desires. But that's a subjective, interpretation of a dream. Dreams uh, may serve as, say, a prophecy. Okay, it's not a desire, but it's a prophecy of something that will happen in after years or how many days or whatever. So an important event, significant event in your life may occur. It may also be like a premonition or like a warning. So yeah, but it doesn't necessarily mean to be a disguised wish alone. Anyway, so ego distorts and hides the wish or latent content of the dream. Anyway, the ego is just the three layers of the part of the three layers of the unconscious mind. And while Simon Freud and Carl Jung and Jacques Lacan were just were the proponents uh, of understanding the mind. Anyway, the ego is the one that has been studied um, first by Simon Freud. So, ego, it distorts and hides the wish or latent content of the dream, thereby allowing the dreamer to remember a somewhat changed and oftentimes, a radically different dream, also called as the manifest dream. That's according to Simon Freud. Okay, we'll talk about ego later on, but anyway, ego is the you know uh, conscious mind of the somewhat conscious mind of the part layer of the mind, conscious layer of the mind. So we have here letter E, mythological as well as sexual images appear in our dreams, according to Carl Jung. Now we have Simon Freud, who first tried to study about the unconscious mind. That there is like a part of our mind that is unconscious, and we're not aware of that. Um, and here comes another a colleague of Simon Freud, Carl Jung, or student of Simon Freud, um, discouraging that the unconscious mind merely contains sexual images. Carl Jung disagrees to that. Instead, he proposed the idea that it's not only the sexual images that is included in the unconscious, but it also includes the mythological one, the ones that is collective in nature and is somewhat similar to all the rest of the people. Something that is not about sexual desires, but rather talks about a deeper meaning, something that is symbolic in nature. Anyway, so dreams are highly structured as language itself. We have to find its similarity. We have to find the similarity of dream and language in a way that language, say a poem or a story, uses symbols. Dreams, most of the time, and majority of it, the content of it, is symbolic in nature. So it's kind of complicated, however, that in dreams, there's a lot of symbols in it. In language, we are conscious about it, although we're conscious about it, but we know that in language, in creating a story or perhaps a poem, we have to make use of some kind of symbolic representation to make sense of it. It's similar to dream, that all these contents in our dream should also represent something. It existed in our mind and has to mean something for us. Okay? And these Carl Jung and Simon Freud somehow tries to delve into its meaning, the symbols in its meaning, and so on and so forth. Okay. But anyway, just want to reiterate or emphasize that for Simon Freud, it's more on sexual images, but for Carl Jung, it's not merely sexual images, but rather mythological as well. Now, according to Lacan, dreams are highly structured as language. No one, yeah, I was able to mention that already. Next one is methodologies. Now, what are these methodologies? Psychobiography, amassing biological information about the author through biographies, personal letters, lectures, and other documents related in some way to the author. Now, to differentiate structuralism, formalism, and psychoanalytic criticism. For psychoanalytic criticism, it does involves understanding and studying the author most of the time, wherein the author's experiences has something to do with his or her work. Okay. In structuralism, it focuses on language, but it also covers the context, the outside forces. For formalism, it focuses focuses more on to the work itself, the content. So you see the difference for psychoanalytic criticism. We have here the author, author's mind. We're trying to understand the author's mind. We're trying to get into the unconscious level of the author, level mind of the author. Okay, and it's kind of challenging though, because we're not psychologists. We don't have any expertise to somehow read someone else's mind, to hypnotize him or her, to reveal his deeper thoughts in from the unconscious. So we don't have that ability. But what we're trying to do in psychoanalytic criticism is we're trying to uncover the meaning of the symbols used in the text, just like the way we interpret dreams. Okay, and by doing so, we have to understand, of course, the life of the author, his or her experiences when he or she was still young, and so on. So by simply walking us through the life of the author when he was or she was still alive, we may be able to somehow relate, uh, the significance and the manifestations of the symbols uh, of his or her work to these experiences. Now let's talk about the characters. Yeah, the second part, letter B, character analysis, studying the various aspects of characters' minds the author had in mind, the particular personality for his or her character. So uh, it is definitely possible that a character, perhaps the main character or the antagonist, is a representation of a part or a parcel of the author's mind. Okay, these mental conversations could have been manifested by the conversation of the characters as well, including their personality. Yeah. Now, Freud's key assumption, Simon Freud's, that he says that all human behavior is, again, talking about the sexually driven directly to a text. That means that all these texts that is written by an author has to say something about their desire, okay, sexual desires. Now, the yonic symbol, the yonic symbol are the concave images, flower, a cup, a cave, a vase. So these symbols that happen to exist in dreams and again possibly been repeated or manifested in the literary text or perhaps in artwork. Again, these are considered as yonic symbols. So they were their desires to engage in some kind of sexual to to satisfy the sexual desire by simply recreating or manifesting those images is symbolic in nature. And for Simon Freud, um, overdoing it, overdoing it could also mean or somehow show to us that the author has wants to uh, is into that kind of symbol, which again is representative to that so-called female. Um, anyway, on the other hand, we also have this phallic symbol, the male, the images such as the tower, the sword, a knife, or a pen, whose length exceeds its diameter. Okay, so it's same exact thing with the idea that I've told you earlier. Any representations could also mean, their attachment, the author's attachment to it. Everything in the text is ultimately the hidden wishes of the author's libido, or their sexual appetite or desire. But again, I'm not what I'm trying to say here in the psychoanalytic criticism is that this is just part of Simon Freud's concept, because he's into sexual desires and so on. That's why these symbolisms in its meaning and representation is just a part of Simon Freud's way of interpreting text. Now there are some another theorist. There is another theorist that somehow proposes a different perspective, who contradicted the idea that the content of the text merely focuses on sexual desire. Here comes Carl Jung. Now, what is the concept of Carl Jung? He is the one who proposed the idea of the so-called archetypal criticism. By showing where and how these images appear in the text and whatever they form recognizable patterns, the archetypal critic believes that he or she will be able to determine the text's meaning. Now, the archetypal criticism, the archetype in general, is a symbol that is universal, which means that we human beings somehow shares same exact idea to its meaning. despite our differences in culture and in geographic location, we still cling on to that particular meaning that is innate in it, that is somewhat representative of a certain idea. Say a sun, the sun. The sun is an archetypal symbol and it represents man. The moon, for example, represents woman. So wherever you go, definitely these symbols somehow represent the same exact thing. The sun, the lion, the light, or whatever. So something representing strength or whatever, and so on. For similar to the moon, the night, darkness or whatever, somehow represent is a representation of a woman, a mystical woman or whatever. So the question is, who created or associated these meanings or ideas to these symbols. For Carl Jung, he was able to he conceived an idea to explain the phenomenon of why we human beings in general around the world agrees to the meaning of these symbols. And he calls that as collective and conscious. We're in these memories of the past and our experiences to the world around us, and how we're inherit by by human beings from the very first time we were born, our history from the very first time of our ancestors up to now. We were able to inherit those set of memories, and all of these were stored in our collective unconscious, and all of these were being shared by us, no matter who you are or where you are right now. Anyway, so okay. Now we have these mythic concepts within text. What is this? Understanding the ancient stories and themes, seeing the relationship to modern stories, and applying archetypal psychoanalysis, we may be able to understand ourselves and our inner psyche. Okay, so our stories, and in the plot, to be specific, the sequence of events in the story has to say something about, has to do with a certain theme, a mythic concept, say reincarnation. The concept of reincarnation, or the birth and the death and the resurrection, has been repeated for some other stories, not only in Catholic or Roman Catholic, narrative of Jesus Christ, the birth, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But we found similar plot in other stories as well, where a human being somehow was born and has to undergo some kind of challenges, and later on becomes different. He was able, or perhaps she was able, to go over and beyond what he's capable of, or she's capable of. Now, the idea of evolving into something better, uh, somehow gives us an idea of a reincarnation. Although it doesn't necessarily mean that someone must die, but it gives us an idea that someone has to accept a certain thought, or encounter, or encounter something like a monster, for example, and later on at the end of the story he becomes a different person, like a superhero. Okay? An ordinary man trying to do his job, and then he must do something, and then at the end of the story he becomes a better person, perhaps a superhero. So that's the reincarnation that we're talking about. And again, it doesn't necessarily need he doesn't necessarily need to die. Okay. Anyway, so those are the mythic concepts that we're talking about. We have a lot of other mythic concepts aside from the birth, death, and resurrection. Um, yeah. So what are the concepts that we have to understand in psychoanalytic criticism? The first one is the conscious part of the mind, or the rational mind. It is the part of the mind that allows you to perceive, record your reality. This is the part where reasoning happens. Okay, so whenever you're conscious, you can definitely reason out. But if you are unconscious, you don't have any ability to reason out, to absorb what is happening around you. Say you're delusional or something. That means you're not conscious. You're imagining things that is not happening in reality. So you are unconscious if that's the case. Anyway, Next one is unconscious, the irrational part. This is contradictory to the conscious part of the mind, where irrational part governs a large part of your actions. It receives and stores our hidden desires, ambitions, fears, passions, and irrational thoughts. So these are the unspoken, things, ideas, thoughts present in our mind, and somehow influences our actions. Now, the unconscious mind is divided into two parts. We have here the eros, and this eros means the sexual instinct, or the libido. Also, we have here the destructive or aggressive instinct. Okay, so we have other concepts like the paraphraxis or Freudian slips. Um, say these desires were somehow revealed in, say, slips of tongue or of our actions. Say you forgot the key in your house, seems to mean to us that you hate your house and you don't want to live in there. Okay, so that kind of idea definitely is symbolic in nature, but it also means something. Um, and when you misspeak or misspeaks the number letters, the numbers six, you might also mean a different thing. So that's a paraphraxis or Freudian slips that we're talking about. The next concept is the id. The id is also part of the unconscious mind. It's also irrational, instinctual, unknown, and unconscious part of the psyche. And the id contains our secret desires, our darkest wishes, our most intense fears. It fulfills pleasurable urges. So take note of this for the id. It fulfills pleasurable urges, including libido and all psychosexual desires. So the id somehow pushes us to do something, uh, uh, something satisfying, okay, something pleasurable. So that is the id. The ego, I've mentioned that earlier, the rational, the logical part of the mind. Anyway, so the superego is the contradictory or the contradiction of the id. Okay, so they go against each other. If the id is after the pleasurable urges, superego, however, causes moral judgment, operates according to the moral principle, which creates a sense of guilt and fear. So it appeals to something that make you feel guilty or fearful about something. Okay, so it is something. It is the one that produces the so-called conscious, as we call it. Okay. And the one, the id, that is the one that somehow represented by angel or something, pushing you to do something pleasurable, and the other one is something dark, sinister, that you'll fear about it, you'll feel guilty about it. Anyway, overlapping phases of development for a healthy psyche. Now, these phases were explained by Simon Freud. We have the oral, the anal, and the phallic stage. So we first begin with the oral phase. When you suck your mother's breast to be fed, um, meaning to say the oral stage, the center of the pleasure here is the mouth. The anal stage, the anus becomes the subject for pleasure. When children learn to delight of defecation and simultaneously realize that they are independent persons who are separate from the mother. So, by the way, going back in oral stage, the mouth is the center or the source of pleasure, means that the mother also is the source of pleasure. Okay. In here, for anal stage, the child somehow experiences pleasure and also realizes that he or she can, get that pleasure even without the presence of the mother. So he knows that he's a separate, independent person and can, satisfy his pleasure by not being with his or her mother. The phallic stage, however, in here, in this stage, the child's sexual desire or libido is directed toward the genitals. When a child learns the pleasure results from stimulating one sexual organ. So this is the part where a child realizes that he or she is an individual being, and and has his potential of sharing it to other people. So by realizing that he has all these sexual organs in him or in her. So those are the stages. Again, going back with the Simon Freud's concept of sexual, psychosexual theory, he discusses that the literary text, and its meaning somehow is represented by the sexual desires hidden in our unconscious. Now we have here the Oedipus complex. The Oedipus complex is an idea conceived by Simon Freud, recognizes a rival for his mother's affection, the father. So the Oedipus complex, if you know the story of the Oedipus the king or Oedipus Rex, Oedipus. I'm sorry, Oedipus kills his father and married his mother. So that's a story. He didn't know about what the things that will happen to him, but he kept on insisting that he has to find the answer. Who he has to find his true parents. But it took some time before he realizes that he was the one who killed his mother. He killed his father and then married um, his mother. But at the end of the story, he gouges his eyes. He became blind. He became a blind, wandering old bard. Okay. Anyway, so castration complex. This is a stage. By the way, the opposite of the Oedipus complex is the Electra complex, wherein the same exact thing somehow is similar to Oedipus, but in this case, this is for the women, wherein women's unfulfilled desire is mitigated, and her sense of lack will be somewhat appeased by the so-called penis envy, where women somehow thought of the desire, having the penis will satisfy them, will satisfy this sexual desire, their unfulfilled desire. And this is also the reason why women somehow tend to find a mate, to complete that so-called desire. Yeah, because without these phallus, the woman should somehow feels incomplete. But again, these concepts were part of the Simon Freud's psychosexual analytic criticism. Now there is a part wherein the man or a woman should repress these desires, the sexual desires, and this happened during the castration complex, wherein a child somehow fears to be castrated by the father, or the woman somehow fears to be castrated by the mother. Yeah, the father. I'm sorry, similar. And then they have to accept the reality that the sexual desire cannot happen and should be found in someone else's. And in this case, the man finds another woman, and then the woman finds a man, to satisfy themselves. The displacement, yeah, the displacement. This is another concept. Redirects and reshapes concealed wishes into acceptable social activities, presenting them in the form of images or symbols in our dreams and or writing. So the displacement, of course, when the person, artist, okay, artist creates or does something as a replacement to that particular result, say social gathering and a date with someone else. So those kind of action replaces and suppresses those pre-existed sexual desire during their infancy stage. Now we move on to the next, personal unconscious, or the waking state, image or thought of which we are aware of at any given moment. So when the personal conscious is the waking state, you're aware of what's happening around you. You know exactly what's happening around you. You feel what you feel. You know what you feel right now. So those are the one that you're using, not the collective unconscious, not the unconscious. The one that you're using when you're awake is the personal conscious mind, and the personal unconscious mind is the one that you use, the part of the mind wherein all the forgotten repressed memory were stored. Okay. Now there's another unconscious part of mind that we have to know, and in this case, we're now talking about the concepts of Carl Jung, the student of Simon Freud, who disagrees about these sexual desires and so on. So Carl Jung, I've mentioned that before in this video already, that he proposed and coined the idea, the word collective unconscious, saying that that the symbols that somehow manifested in our dreams is not sexual symbols, are not sexual symbols, or rather these are mythological symbols. These are archetypes and has to mean something, not sexual, but something. Anyway, so what is this collective unconscious? It houses the cumulative knowledge, experiences, and images of the entire human species. Okay, so we have our ancestors, and that they have their experiences. They have experienced a lot of things, perhaps fear, perhaps the desire, and these were collected and been imprinted in our DNA, imprinted in our mind, and we, for some reason, somehow created a representation, a symbolic representation of these patterns. So the collective unconscious contains symbols, which is a product of a pattern of human experiences. So we'll talk about these patterns. What are these experiences in the pattern? So the archetypes, here another word, letter O, are archetypes. These are the patterns or images of repeated human experiences. So the question is, what are these repeated human experiences that were imprinted in our brain, that we somehow inherited genetically through the psyche? So here we have some examples, like birth, death, rebirth, the four seasons, the motherhood. So let's begin with death. So birth is an experience, and we know that, and it's a patterned experience. Now, what are these symbolic representation symbols that may be represented, that may used to represent birth? The experience of birth. Say an egg, right? So it may represent birth. Um, Death, darkness, night, um, black. Even the color itself may represent something. So the black may also represent death. The shadow may represent death, or perhaps a monster, right? Yeah, with skite and so on. So yeah, rebirth may also mean, say, a coffin. Hmm? Coffin, or I don't know, the four seasons, like the north, the south, the west, and the east. The main for the main direction definitely would also mean the four seasons. The motherhood, we have a lot of representations of the motherhood, like the gods and the goddesses. In Greek, we have Hera. We also have the earth as the caring or nurturing being, yeah, and so on. So in Catholic, we have here a motherhood, say Mary, the mother of Christ. So she is a woman, and she represents the concept of motherhood. Now there are expressed these are expressed in stories, in dreams, in religion, and fantasies. So these symbols represent a pattern experience. A pattern experience. These are not symbols mainly because our human being forces himself, uh, forces an idea to be associated to that thing. So it took some time, years, 100 years perhaps, for us to realize, without us knowing, that these patterns, exists anyway. So we also have other archetypes, say anima and the animus. The anima is the feminine side of the male, and the animus is the masculine side of the female. So we have these idea of completeness, the two sides of a coin, perhaps, or the two-headed god, the god and the goddess, the god with multiple hands and so on, a god with multiple, faces, a god a character who has multiple personality, whatever. So these are representations um, of the animus in the anima. So these, we have a lot of examples of archetypes, but for now that's all. By the way, I'd like to add, aside from the animus and the animus, we also have the shadow archetype. Something, it represents dark. It represents something like fear, and you as a human being should face that particular shadow in order for you to move on, and move on to your life, or somehow reach that so-called center, yourself. We call that self in Carl Jung's collective unconscious, the self. Okay, without facing that shadow, you might not be able to reach that so-called self or your completeness, sense of completeness. Okay, yeah, that's all. Thank you so much. That's all for psychoanalytic criticism.